which signals that contact or communications have been restored also with the lost world to which by legal rights he belongs. He composed his Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, you will recall, as petition for the return of his rights, and thus as demonstration that his condition had stabilized to the point that he now could entertain diplomatic relations with the other reality he had once saw through and recognized as authoritative in its own rights. In his confessional discourse, Lobo, as already mentioned, simply did not see his complicity in the torture sessions that he attended only as military doctor to reverse the damages. He did admit, however, that one of his interventions could be interpreted by the uninformed as torture. Once, between sessions, he administered electroshocks to the legs of a political prisoner, but only as treatment, whereby the symptoms of her paralysis could be reversed. Lobo thus touched on another outer limit against which psychoanalysis measured the first world widening of its range of influence. The alleged longer-term success of the psychoanalytic approach to treatment of shell-shocked soldiers was predicated on Freud's recognition that the so-called flight into illness was reversed through sporadic current treatments, for example, only for as long as the treatment was more tortuous than what the soldier looked forward to on the front. But that means, in the short term, adjusted to the exigencies of returning soldiers to the combat zone, various shock and fright techniques were thus efficacious and were in fact integrated in mitigated but still recognizable form in the eclecticized analytic approaches improvised for the short term of war, as documented in the 1919 collection, Psychoanalysis and the War Neuroses, to which Freud contributed his highly influential introduction. Thus, his reference, Lobo's reference, to the electrical treatment was again the closest he came to admitting his involvement in the torture regimen. Now, political prisoners are, of course, tortured to make them tell all, are questioned and tested, according to the age-old cohabitation of testing and torture that Avital Ronell has analyzed in the first part of her study, The Test Drive. Hans Fürchner, a German-Brazilian studies scholar, considered the connection in the Lobo-Cabanit affair between torture and psychoanalysis as the kind of opposition that reveals as much gap as latent overlap. Why, in the course of Brazil's redemocratization, was the case of Dr. Lobo, a psychoanalyst, of all the many known cases of medical doctors participating in the torture of political prisoners, the solo showstopper? We all already know some possible phantasmatic connections or latent affinities, if only because they keep on making it into pictures. In the setting of torture, there would appear to be a special psychic relationship between the punitive master and the victim. Thus, back to Fürchner, dread of analytic abuse can be found between the lines of the compact whereby the client or analysand submits to the rules, the scheduling, the frame. The difference, Fürchner allowed, is that the initial asymmetry in the analytic relationship, which is open to interpretation as punitive, becomes more symmetrical, as even to some extent reversed. In other words, the view of analysis as tortuous testing belongs to resistance to psychoanalysis. Since Lobo sees himself on the sidelines of tortuous testing, occupied or cathected as healing and reversal of the damage, he, like Schreber, admits torture but contains it as not threatening the egoic attention span. Schreber endures the torture of insertions into and deletions from his body because the damages are always also undone, and like a cartoon figure, he is again ready to bounce back for more. This resetting of torture, at least in Schreber's memoirs, signifies an endopsychic representation of the resistance in psychoanalysis. In his last essays on psychoanalysis, Derrida focused on the destinal multiplicity of the notion of resistance as part and portrait of the fundamental disunity or self-difference of psychoanalysis itself. In other words, among all the resistances psychoanalysis works through, there is also the resistance in psychoanalysis to itself. The twist I would like to emphasize in this reading is that the disunity of psychoanalysis is also the enigmatic force driving its metabolism along shifting transferential relations toward and across its limit concepts and borderlines. On the other side are death and psychosis, as Derrida emphasized. For example, in a reading of Foucault that stays so close that it can reclaim as possibility the following passage from The Order of Things. So I quote Derrida quoting Foucault. When language emerges in all its nudity, it at the same time eludes all signification, as if it were a vast and empty despotic system. When desire reigns in the wild state, as if the rigor of its rule had leveled all opposition. When death dominates every psychological function and stands above it as its unique and devastating norm, then we recognize madness in its present form, madness as it is posited in the modern experience as its truth and its alterity. This is why psychoanalysis finds in that madness par excellence, which psychiatrists term schizophrenia, its intimate, its most invincible torture. For, given in this form of madness, in an absolutely manifest and absolutely withdrawn form, are the forms of finitude towards which it usually advances unceasingly and interminably from the starting point of that which is voluntarily, involuntarily offered to it in the patient's language. So psychoanalysis recognizes itself when it is confronted with those very psychoses which nevertheless, or rather for that very reason, it has scarcely any means of reaching, as if the psychosis were displaying in a savage illumination and offering in a mode not too distant but just too close, that towards which analysis must make its laborious way. Following Derrida, we are not constrained to see this inside view of the psychoanalytic relationship to psychosis as impasse or impassive death sentence. Foucault gives the testing relations that Walter Benjamin picked up on in a mass culture immersed in psychoanalysis, the negative twist of torture, torture that tests psychoanalysis itself as it makes its painstaking way down the borderline between neurosis and psychosis inside psychosis. Thinking abandoned to endless testing, perhaps beginning with Descartes, risks the madness that is at home alone, where we must begin anew from scratch, the scratch in the record of our ego libido. Among the endopsychic insights illuminated within Schreber's delusional system, we find a certain loopy realization of testing, specifically of reality testing or reality as testing. Though encrusted with the details of his system and of all the defunct systems allegorically passing through it, Schreber's inside view can just the same be summarized by Ronell's analysis of a certain techno-order of testing, the one in which we reside. I quote, "An elliptical circuit has been established between testing and the real. A circuit so radically installed, it is irreversible, cancels the essential difference between the test and what was assumed to be real. At this point, somewhere between Freud and Nietzsche, it is not so much the case that reality is being tested, but that testing is constitutive